Music and Poetry, A Timeless Relationship by Alexia Milipoulou, by July 2021. Music and Poetry, A Timeless Relationship. The relationship between music and poetry is so strong that it has survived the ages. Music and poetry has been challenged, questioned, scrutinized, but is still alive today to prove that some bonds are hard to break. While each is an autonomous form of art, music and poetry work well together. Yes, there's a close connection between many forms of art: dancing, painting, performing, architecture, sculpture. They are all forms of expression. But there's something unique that connects poetry and music, and the interesting part is that it does so for centuries. When music and poetry first met, music has been part of all societies around the globe. To what it seems to be the beginning of time, it is believed that music was originated in Africa by tribes that used various materials to create what we know today as instruments to produce sounds. These instruments became an essential part of every culture and influenced all aspects of life. In other words, music and poetry have influenced all aspects of life: religion, climate, economic and social factors, customs. Poetry, as a form of rhythmic language that intends to evoke meaning, was known before written text and was used to remember laws, family history, events. To remember and not to forget, some phrases were repeated. The tone of voice was rhythmic. It is perhaps when poetry and music met. The Greek rhapsodies, the Japanese tanka, the Chinese shijing are all typical examples of sung poems. Eventually, the forms and genres of poetry broadened, and while used for different purposes and were of various lengths, they all included some rhythm: epics, hymns, psalms, elegies, hadiths, surahs. Lyric poetry, an excellent example of poetry and music combined. The repeated phrases of verbal poets resemble the refrain of lyrics in a song. Besides, the goal is the same: to remember the song or the lyrics. Now, the word lyrics and its derivatives, lyricism, lyric, lyre, play a vital role in the relationship between music and poetry. Lyrical is one of the three categories of poetry, epic and dramatic being the other two, as seen by Aristotle. Lyre is a harp-like musical instrument dominant in ancient Greece. Lyricism is expressing beautiful feelings in the form of music. So how is it all connected? Ultimately, a lyric poem is that which expresses emotion. Of course, the difference here is that lyric poems were meant to be sung, at least most of the time, and we've seen them in the form of sonnets, odes, elegies, ballads. Both the 19th and 20th centuries were swamped by lyrical poets: Keats, Byron, Shelley, Yeats, Plath. Going back in time, we meet Schiller, Goethe, Milton, Shakespeare, Petrarch. The connection of music and poetry. The strong bond between music and poetry is clearer when the two forms of art are seen independently. Each of them can stand alone, but each of them get inspired by the other. It is obvious that there are many forms of music as there are many forms of poetry, and they cannot always coexist. Take for example, the Cubist Breakup by E. Cummings. For example, could it ever have a melody attached to it? Not all poems can blend with music. Then again, we must make a distinction here. The lyrics of a song can be beautiful enough and structured in such a way as to be considered a poem, but not all lyrics are poems. And so our main concern is to see how a poem, which was not meant to be sung, blended with music as nicely as to become popular. That's a very crucial point the history of the relationship between poetry and music. Poems, which would have gone unnoticed, have been loved by people when they became songs. In Greece, the poem Onissi, written by Nobel laureate and one of the biggest Greek poets, Georgios Zephyrus, became extremely popular when it was composed by Miki Theodorakis. I hope I said that right. It is said that T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, inspired by Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, and that Claude Debussy's prelude L'après-midi d'un faune was inspired by Stéphane Mallarmé's Afternoon of a Faun, and that Maurice Ravel composed the Trois Poèmes de Mallarmé based on the poems by Mallarmé. Clearly, poets are inspired by composers, and composers are inspired by poets. This fact alone underlines how powerful these forms of art are to inspire others to create masterpieces. It also implies that they have some common roots. Diction, for instance. That's the choice and arrangement of words to form a poem. But doesn't music follow similar rules? Music embraces poetry, and poetry embraces music. It is often believed that the written form of poetry created a distance from music. The tune of the verbal poetry was missing, but one would argue that this connected the two forms of art even more by giving rhythm to the words, hence the birth of ballads. For example, in Iran, the verb khandan is used to describe reading poetry and singing. Mallarmé sought to create the effect of music through poetry by emphasizing how a poem sounds, instead of what the deeper meanings of the words are. Many people do not love poetry simply because they don't understand it, but they do when they sing the words of a poem. Surely not all poems are easy to read, and some are only reserved for scholars, while everybody else can feel the music. In this context, poetry sounds like the bad guy, when the truth is all forms of art follows some rules and techniques. Poetry read out loud gives a wavy tone to the sound, so alike, just like musical notes. One word connects both cadence, the rise and fall of sound, whether by an instrument or human voice. Cadence is also what connects Shakespeare and Eliot to the contemporary rapper and poet Kendrick Lamar. The words that comprise a poem have a rhyme and get a rhythm while whispered or spoken, leaving a ringing to the listener. Even when the rhyme is absent, like in T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, the sound of words become more powerful. This is fully associated with the selection of words and the way they are connected to bring out emotions and set the tone. In other words, it has to do with the poet's skill. At this point, the poem's connection to the music is displayed by the sound of the words, the way the poem is read, and that's where its lyrical expression is revealed. What enables the timeless relationship of music and poetry? Poetry is about rhythm, flow, expression, feelings, deeper meanings. Instructional music shows as much expression, where it certainly flows and emits emotions, with the main difference being the absence of words. There's a mode of repetition, whether in the form of words or musical notes, to create a pattern, to act as a reminder, to make it unforgettable, to draw emphasis. The repeated phrases are noticed in Homer and the religious texts of ancient India, Vedas, and are present today in most poems and musical compositions. Repetition creates flow, and that's what connects the two arts. How did poetry and music manage to have a successful marriage for centuries? The poems, which would have otherwise been lost under stacks of paper, were sung by people. Music takes a whole new meaning as it approaches the human soul with words, which expresses personal emotion. And let's not forget that the artists of both forms are affected by their surroundings, the current socioeconomic environment, the dominant beliefs and customs of their culture, of that poet, the poet's personal experiences, and their interaction with other poets and musicians. Interestingly enough, while many things change along the way, some don't. The method of alliteration used by Dickinson is used by many rappers today. The iambic pentameter is still dominant today because it is the closest it can get to the way people talk in their everyday life. It's hardly surprising why music and poetry make such a nice couple for centuries and will likely do so for eternity. So when you think to yourself, what is a poem? Think of a poem as a song or written language meant to be sung. And as I said in one of my lectures, in oral cultures, before people wrote things down, in order for people to remember customs, laws, hero stories, and traditions, storytellers would put morals, what to do, like right and wrong, laws into stories, so that the people would know how to behave, the people would know the religion, the people would have their own customs, people would be able to worship their heroes, and that's what would knit the society together. When you have that's what they mean by an oral society. And then when everything got written down, stories continued to tell people about their past and tell people about their tradition, about their heroes, and to remember laws. And also in oral, even when things got written down, most people were illiterate because only rich people or the clergy knew how to read. So in order for the storyteller to remember the story, that the storyteller would write the story in rhyme, or he would sing the story with rhyme, poetry, and music, because people love listening to music and people love a good story. So that's how music and poetry made a perfect couple. Because back in the day, you got to remember, there was a time before radio, television, internet, and so people gathered together in a circle, and to entertain themselves, people told stories to each other, or they sung to each other songs that they liked. And the songs, that's why poetry and music, I would say, predates written language. Because you can have poetry, but someone would memorize a story, and it's easier to memorize a story that's got rhyme than a regular story without rhyme. That's another reason why poets put rhyme into poetry. So poetry and music have been married together since the beginning of time. And so when you think of, and as we enter our poetry unit, week 5 and 6, so be prepared to read aloud the poems that you are assigned. So I hope you enjoy the week 5 and 6, the poetry unit. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me.